The morning Grover Hatch made the worst decision of his political career. The desert air over Copper Ridge smelled like motor oil and creosote, and something older than both the particular stillness that settles over a California high desert town before the heat arrives and reminds everyone exactly where they are and exactly how small they are against the landscape that surrounds them. But that comes later. What you need to understand first is the wall. Every motorcycle club has one. In church halls and union lodges and VFW posts across this country, there are walls where the dead are kept alive. Photographs, patches, handwritten names on painted wood. The wall inside the Desert Iron Charter's clubhouse on the eastern edge of Copper Ridge had been accumulating for 21 years. 19 names, 19 men who had ridden with Rex Malone and were now riding somewhere he couldn't follow. He knew every face. He knew the year each one was taken, in the circumstances, and in several cases the last word spoken. That wall was not decoration. It was the reason the club existed. It was the answer to the question every outsider eventually asked. Why do men like you need each other so badly? Rex Malone was 58 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, 230 pounds of a life lived entirely on his own terms, which meant a life that had cost him things most men never have to pay. His beard had gone silver 4 years ago, and he hadn't fought it. The lines around his eyes were deep, the kind that come not just from sun and wind, but from watching things you cannot stop. He had been president of the Desert Iron Charter for 16 years. Before that, he had been sergeant-at-arms for 6. Before that, he had been a young man from Barstow who discovered that the only place in the world where he felt fully himself was on the back of a motorcycle moving at speed through open country, and that the only people who truly understood that feeling were men who shared it. He was not what people expected when they pictured the president of a Hells Angels charter. The residents of Copper Ridge had learned this over 2 decades of proximity. Rex Malone had organized the water distribution after the flash floods of 2019 destroyed the lower neighborhoods near Mesquite Creek. He had shown up with 6 club members and 3 flatbed trucks full of bottled water and shelf-stable food before the county emergency services had even completed their damage assessment. He had never spoken to a reporter about it. He had never asked for recognition. He had simply done it because the people of Copper Ridge were his people, the way any man's hometown becomes his people after long enough. And because in his understanding of the world you helped when helping was needed, and you ask questions later. This is not to say Rex Malone was a saint. He was not. He had lived a hard life in a hard world and had made choices that would not survive scrutiny in a courtroom. But the residents of Copper Ridge had long since arrived at a more nuanced understanding of the man than the one offered by the county sheriff's department press releases. They knew him, and knowing him, they trusted him. What they did not know, what almost no one knew, was the thing that lived behind his eyes in the quiet moments, the thing that surfaced when the clubhouse emptied out at night and he sat alone at the heavy oak table in the back room staring at nothing in particular. Her name had been Carol. They had been married for 11 years. She had been 39 years old when the oncologist used the word malignant, and 41 when she died in a hospital room in San Bernardino on a Tuesday afternoon in October, while the Santa Ana winds rattled the windows and Rex sat beside her bed holding her hand and understanding with a clarity that felt like a physical blow that he had arrived 3 days too late. Not too late to be with her. He had been there. He had not left her side in the final week. Too late in the only way that mattered. There had been a treatment, an experimental bone marrow protocol being administered at a clinic in Portland that had shown extraordinary results in cases like Carol's, a specific and aggressive variant of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that conventional chemotherapy was failing to contain. The protocol was not covered by their insurance. The insurance company's denial letter had cited insufficient clinical evidence of efficacy and had arrived in a standard white envelope on a Wednesday morning, and Rex had read it 4 times before he understood what it meant. He had spent the next 11 days fighting. He had called the insurance company 17 times. He had retained an attorney. He had liquidated investments. He had called in every favor owed to him by every person in his network, and he had won eventually. The appeals process had moved in their favor. The treatment had been approved and funded, but the treatment required Carol to be strong enough to travel, and by the time the approval came through, she was not. 3 days. 3 days between the approval and the morning she stopped being strong enough to make the drive to the airport. She had never made it to Portland. The treatment that might have saved her life had been approved too late to be used, and Rex Malone had carried that specific arithmetic, that brutal, senseless gap of 72 hours inside his chest like a stone for 14 years. He never talked about it. Not to Wade Briggs, not to Frank Odom, not to anyone. But it was there, and it shaped everything. It was Wade who first brought him the news about Gracie Pruitt. Wade Briggs was 44 years old, the Desert Iron Charter's sergeant-at-arms, and the closest thing Rex had to a second-in-command who truly understood how his president's mind worked. Wade was compact and precise, where Rex was large and still. He had a scarred jaw from a highway incident in his early 30s and a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was thinking through something difficult, which was what he was doing the evening he walked into the clubhouse and set a photograph and a piece of paper on the table in front of Rex. Rex looked at the photograph first. A little girl, 6 years old according to the note written in a woman's handwriting on the back. Dark hair, pale face, enormous brown eyes, and a smile that belonged to someone who did not yet fully understand what was happening to her body. The piece of paper was a denial letter from a health insurance company. Rex had seen a letter exactly like it before. He recognized the formatting, the clinical language, the precise bureaucratic coldness of a corporation explaining why a sick person would not be receiving the help they needed. He read it once, he set it down. He looked at the photograph again. Donna Pruitt Wade told him had been working the early shift at Crestline Diner on the south end of Copper Ridge for 9 years. She was 38 years old. She was a single mother. Her daughter Gracie had been diagnosed 6 weeks ago with a rare and aggressive form of pediatric leukemia. The experimental bone marrow treatment she needed was available at a specialized pediatric oncology center in Seattle. The cost was $250,000. The insurance company had denied the claim. Rex picked up the photograph of Gracie Pruitt. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it face up on the table where he could see it. He did not ask about the cost. He did not ask about the logistics. He did not ask whether it was feasible or whether the numbers worked. He said, "Start organizing." What followed over the next 6 weeks was the kind of effort that only becomes possible when a man with Rex Malone's particular combination of network reputation and absolute personal conviction decides that something is going to happen. The event was called the Desert Run. It would be a tri-state charity motorcycle ride, barbecue, and auction, starting at the county fairgrounds on the eastern edge of Copper Ridge and running the length of Highway 9 through the Kern County high desert before looping back through town. They filed for the parade permit through the proper channels. They paid the required fees. They arranged liability insurance. They contacted the City Council's events office and received in writing the formal approval of the Highway 9 parade route. Wade coordinated with charter contacts in Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon. Confirmations came back steadily. 100 riders, 200. By the end of the 4th week, they had commitments from more than 400 motorcyclists from across the Southwest. Corporate sponsors in Copper Ridge and the surrounding communities had quietly agreed to contribute. A local auctioneer had donated his services for an evening event. A country music band from Bakersfield had offered to play for free. They were tracking toward $280,000. Enough for Gracie's treatment, her recovery care, and a small apartment near the Seattle facility for Donna to stay in while her daughter fought for her life. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be: a community coming together for a sick child organized by men who wore leather instead of suits. Sheriff Grover Hatch had been watching them for 4 months. This was the detail that Rex would only fully understand later, after Frank Odom had pulled apart the financial architecture of Hatch's operation and laid it out in clear, devastating terms. The surveillance of the Desert Iron Charter had not begun in response to the Desert Run. It had begun in the spring, a calculated, deliberate monitoring operation conducted by Hatch's office with one specific purpose: to identify the moment when the club would make a public move large enough to justify a high-profile response. Grover Hatch was 52 years old and had been sheriff of Kern County for 6 years. He had the jawline of a man who had always understood that appearance was its own form of currency, and the political instincts of someone who had spent his entire adult life treating public service as a ladder rather than a calling. His internal polling for the state Senate campaign he had been quietly building toward for 18 months had returned a consistent and troubling finding. He was perceived as soft on organized crime. In a district that stretched from the southern San Joaquin Valley to the edge of the Mojave, that perception was fatal. He needed a visible victory. He needed an image himself standing firm against a credible threat, the kind of footage that played well in television advertisements and resonated with voters who had never set foot in Kern County but would form opinions about him based on 30-second clips. The Desert Iron Charter was the largest, most visible, most media-ready target in his jurisdiction. He had been waiting for exactly this moment. The intelligence report he eventually used to justify his intervention, the claim that rival motorcycle clubs were planning to attend the Desert Run, and that a gang conflict was imminent, did not exist in any meaningful sense. There was no credible intelligence. There were no rival clubs planning anything. There was a document that Hatch's office had assembled from fragments of old reports, speculation and outright fabrication. Given the appearance of legitimacy by the official letterhead, it was printed on in the signature of a deputy who would later deeply regret putting his name on it. Rex Malone received his summons to the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning 4 days before the Desert Run was scheduled to depart. He drove there in his truck, not on his motorcycle. Wade rode alongside. They walked into the building wearing their cuts, the leather vests with the desert iron patches, and were escorted to Sheriff Hatch's office on the second floor, a large, carefully curated room with photographs of Hatch shaking hands with politicians on every available surface. Hatch was seated behind his desk when they entered. He did not stand to greet them. He let a thick manila folder fall from his hand onto the desk blotter with a sound that was clearly intended to be significant. "Your parade permit has been revoked," he said. "County jurisdiction, highway safety concerns." Rex stood with his arms crossed. He had expected something. He had not known what form it would take, but he had understood since the day the Desert Run was announced that men like Grover Hatch did not sit still when they saw an opportunity, and that the opportunity the Desert Run represented for a politician with Hatch's particular ambitions was substantial. "The city council approved the permit," Rex said. "We paid the fees. The insurance is in order. The route is locked." Hatch explained with the smooth, reasonable tone of a man who had rehearsed this that the county's jurisdiction over highway safety superseded the city council's authority in matters involving credible threats to public order. He said, received intelligence indicating that rival organizations were planning to attend the Desert Run. He could not in good conscience allow a confrontation to develop on county roads. The highway would be closed to the charter's organization on Saturday. Wade moved forward. His voice was quiet and very controlled, which was the most dangerous version of Wade Briggs. "There are no rival clubs coming," he said. "This is a permitted charity event for a 6-year-old child with cancer. You know that." Hatch looked at Wade with the expression of a man who had already decided the conversation was over. He said that from where he was sitting, the Desert Iron Charter was a criminal enterprise, using a sick child as a public relations instrument. He said it without breaking eye contact. Then he told them in terms that left no ambiguity what would happen if they attempted to ride Highway 9 on Saturday morning. 80 deputies in full riot gear at the county line, every motorcycle impounded. Mass arrests on charges of unlawful assembly violation of gang injunction statutes and disturbing the peace. The club would spend years in court. The legal fees alone would bankrupt the charter. The Desert Run was finished. Go home. Rex looked at Grover Hatch for 5 full seconds. It was a particular kind of silence, not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and saw no reason to announce it. Then he nodded once, a slow and final movement, and walked out of the office. On the courthouse steps, Wade lit a cigarette. His hands were not entirely steady. Rex stood still, looking out at the parking lot and the flat desert horizon beyond it. "What's the play?" Wade said. Rex said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He wants a riot. He needs footage of us fighting his deputies so he can run it in his campaign ads. We give him violence and he wins. And if he wins, Gracie Pruitt dies in a hospital that won't treat her because her mother's insurance company decided it wasn't worth the cost. So we shut it down." Rex turned and looked at him. "No, we give him exactly what he asked for. And then we take everything he has." The news spread through Copper Ridge the way news moves in a small town faster than it should, carried on the particular current of collective outrage that flows when a community understands it is being treated with contempt by someone in authority. The local radio stations ran the story within hours. Donna Pruitt appeared on the evening news broadcast of the regional CBS affiliate, holding a photograph of Gracie, her voice steady but her eyes full, asking the sheriff's department to reconsider. She did not perform distress. She simply told the truth, which was more devastating than any performance could have been. Sheriff Hatch released a statement an hour later. It expressed deep personal sympathy for the Jenkins family. He got the name wrong, which no one in the charter failed to notice, and reiterated his commitment to public safety. The statement had clearly been written by a professional. It was polished and compassionate and completely empty. Rex was not watching the news coverage. He was on the telephone. Frank Odom had been a member of the Desert Iron Charter for 7 years in his early 30s, before leaving the club earning a law degree from UC Hastings on the back of a decade of grinding night school and establishing a corporate litigation practice in San Francisco that currently occupied the 31st floor of a building on California Street. He was 55 years old, still rode a motorcycle on weekends when his schedule permitted, and owed Rex Malone a debt that had never been formally acknowledged between them, but that both men understood completely. Rex had kept Frank alive during a particular 18-month period in the late 90s, when Frank's judgment had been poor, and the consequences of poor judgment in their world were frequently permanent. Frank had never forgotten it. When Rex called him Tuesday night and explained what he needed, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about Ridgeline Properties." Rex told him what he knew, which was incomplete but significant. For 3 years, Rex had been hearing things about Grover Hatch's civil asset forfeiture program. Highway 9 ran through Kern County and connected to Interstate 40, and Hatch's deputies had been stopping out-of-state drivers, particularly those traveling through in vehicles with out-of-state plates and cash, and seizing that cash under the legal fiction that it was connected to drug trafficking. Civil asset forfeiture required no criminal conviction. No charges needed to be filed. The money simply disappeared into the county's asset forfeiture fund, and from there, according to the whispers Rex had been collecting for 3 years, into a private company called Ridgeline Properties, which had recently acquired several commercial properties in adjacent counties and was registered through a series of intermediary entities to a man named Dale Hatch, the sheriff's brother-in-law. "This is a tall order," Frank said. "Forensic financial work at this level takes months under normal circumstances." "There is no normal circumstances here," Rex said. "A little girl runs out of time if this doesn't happen. I need it by Friday." There was a pause on the line. "I'll have it by Friday," Frank said. What Rex did not anticipate, what he should have anticipated but underestimated, because even after decades of operating in proximity to men like Grover Hatch, he still occasionally forgot how genuinely frightened small men become when they feel the ground shifting under them, was what the sheriff would do before Saturday. Hatch needed to break the club's will. He needed them frightened and demoralized and off balance before the morning of the desert run, so that the blockade would feel like the final blow rather than the opening move. He needed Rex Malone to walk into Saturday morning already feeling like a beaten man. On Thursday night, the clubhouse on the eastern edge of Copper Ridge received a visit. There were 12 deputies in tactical gear. There were flashbang grenades, there were battering rams and assault rifles, and the coordinated professional brutality of a unit that had been given permission to destroy something and had taken that permission seriously. The legal justification was an anonymous tip regarding illegal firearms, a tip that, as would later be established in federal court, had been generated internally by Hatch's office and bore no relation to anything resembling actual intelligence. Rex was at the table in the back room when they came through the front windows. The first grenade detonated 6 feet to his left, and the concussion hit him like a wall. He was on the floor before he fully understood what was happening, and by the time his vision cleared, there were rifle muzzles pointed at him from 3 directions, and deputies shouting instructions at a volume and pitch calibrated to produce compliance through pure sensory overload. Wade was across the room, face down, hands behind his head. Rex could see the muscles in Wade's arms and shoulders, the specific tension of a man fighting his own instincts with everything he had. Their eyes met across 15 feet of polished concrete floor. Rex gave him the smallest possible shake of his head. Stand down. They lay on the floor while Hatch's deputies took the clubhouse apart. Pool table upended and the slate cracked. Leather couches opened with combat knives, the stuffing pulled out in gray clouds. Frame photographs taken from the wall, Rex's wall, the wall where his brothers lived, and dropped carelessly, glass shattering, frames bending. A deputy walked across the photographs with his boots. Rex watched it happen and did not move. Grover Hatch himself came through the door 20 minutes into the search, dressed in his formal uniform, with the gold insignia catching the light from the emergency floods the team had erected in the parking lot. He walked through the wreckage with the careful, measured stride of a man who wanted to appear reluctant, but could not entirely suppress the satisfaction underneath. He looked at Rex on the floor and said nothing. He walked a slow circuit of the destroyed room. He looked disappointed that no one had fought back, because fighting back would have been cleaner, would have given him the footage he needed. The justification, the narrative of law enforcement bravely confronting dangerous criminals. He found nothing. There was nothing to find. The club was clean, had been clean for years, and Hatch had known this before he sent the team in. The raid was not about evidence. It was about the wall. It was about making Rex Malone lie on the floor of his own clubhouse while a man in a tailored uniform walked through the remains of his brother's photographs. When the deputies finally filed out, leaving the wreckage behind them in the silence, Rex pushed himself to his feet. Wade stood across the room, his face the color of old ash. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles were visible beneath the skin. They destroyed everything, Wade said. We let them walk in here and do this to us, Rex. Rex looked at the wall, the empty wall. 19 men who had ridden with him, whose faces had looked down from that surface for years now, scattered across the floor in broken glass and bent aluminum frames. He looked at it for a long time. Let them have their moment, he said finally. His voice was entirely level. This is what desperate men do when they're out of real moves. It only shows us how scared he is. He bent down and picked up one of the photographs from the floor. A man named Garrett Sims, who had died in 2009 in a highway accident outside Needles. He set it carefully on the table, face up. Get the windows covered, he told Wade. Keep every bike fueled and ready. We ride Saturday at 9 in the morning. He picked up his phone and dialed. Frank, he said when the line connected. Tell me you've got something. I've got everything, Frank Odom said. And Rex, you need to understand what you're actually holding here. This isn't political leverage. This is a federal case. I know what it is, Rex said. I need it by tomorrow. I'm driving down in the morning, Frank said. Rex sat down at the heavy oak table. The clubhouse was cold now, the front windows gone, the night air moving through the space where glass had been. Around him, the other charter members had begun the quiet work of cleaning up, picking up shattered frames, gathering torn leather, sweeping broken glass into piles. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out his wallet. Inside, behind his license and behind a folded receipt he had been carrying for 6 months and kept forgetting to throw away, was a photograph. Small, worn at the edges. Carol at 37, standing on the back deck of the house they had rented in Wrightwood the summer before her diagnosis, laughing at something off camera, completely unaware that her body was already beginning its betrayal. He looked at her for a moment, then he put the wallet away. He looked at the photograph of Garrett Sims on the table. He looked at the empty wall. Grover Hatch thought the worst was over. He thought the raid had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish, that he had looked into the eyes of Rex Malone on the floor of his own home and shown him exactly how this was going to go. He thought the desert run was finished. He thought that by Saturday morning, when his 80 deputies stood in full riot gear behind 5 county plow trucks blocking Highway 9, they would be standing against a club that had already been broken. Grover Hatch did not know Rex Malone. Friday morning arrived cold and pale over the Kern County desert. Frank Odom drove into Copper Ridge in a rented car at 11 in the morning and walked into the repaired, boarded-up clubhouse carrying a sealed hard drive in an inside coat pocket. He sat across from Rex at the oak table and laid it on the surface between them. "It's all there," Frank said. "Wire transfers going back 4 years. The incorporation documents for Ridgeline Properties traced through 2 intermediate holding companies to Dale Hatch. Bank routing numbers. Transaction histories showing the movement of seized asset funds from the county forfeiture account into Ridgeline's operating accounts." And he paused. "There's a photograph. Dale Hatch meeting with a man named Roderick Payne at the Doubletree in Bakersfield. October of last year. Payne is currently under active federal investigation for money laundering operations. The FBI has been watching Payne for 2 years. The moment they see this photograph and the financial connection to the county forfeiture program, they will have everything they need to open a RICO investigation into Grover Hatch's office." Rex picked up the drive. "You sent a copy to the FBI," he said. "It wasn't a question. I walked it into the Sacramento field office this morning before I drove down," Frank said. "I spoke with an agent named Garrison on the Public Corruption Task Force. He was very interested." Rex nodded slowly. "The FBI moves on its own timeline," Frank said carefully. "I know," Rex said, "but I need something that moves on mine." He set the drive in his shirt pocket in the same place where he kept Carol's photograph. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I'm going to walk up to Grover Hatch in front of his 80 deputies and every news camera in the county, and I'm going to give him a choice. And I need him to believe with absolute certainty that the choice is real." He looked at Frank. "Is it real, Frank?" Odom looked back at him. "Every word of it," he said. Rex stood up from the table. He walked to the covered window and stood looking at the boards that had replaced the glass. Outside, he could hear the other charter members moving around the lot, voices, the clink of tools, the occasional rev of an engine being checked. Tomorrow, 400 motorcycles would line up at the county fairgrounds. Donna Pruitt would stand near the front, holding her daughter, and Gracie would be wearing the small leather vest that the charter had made for her, a tiny version of the Desert Iron, cut her name on the back, where the territory patch would go on a full member. The whole town of Copper Ridge would line the streets. And at the end of Highway 9, Grover Hatch would be standing behind his plow trucks and his riot shields, in his borrowed authority, waiting for Rex Malone to either fold or explode. Rex Malone was going to do neither. He turned from the window. "Get some sleep," he told Frank. "We've got an early start." He sat back down at the table alone after Frank left. He picked up Garrett Sims's photograph and looked at it for a moment, then set it down. He looked at the wall, at the bare empty surface where 19 men used to look back at him. He reached into his wallet and took out Carol's photograph again. He set it on the table next to Garrett's. Then he sat in the cold and the quiet of the damaged clubhouse in the town where he had spent the best and worst years of his life, and he waited for morning. Frank Odom left Copper Ridge at midnight, driving back toward the highway with his headlights cutting through the desert dark. Rex heard the car pull out of the lot, and then there was nothing, just the wind moving through the boards on the front windows and the particular silence of a building that had been violated and not yet fully healed. He did not sleep that night, not because he was afraid and not because he was uncertain about what the morning would bring. He did not sleep because in the hours after Frank left, something settled over him that was not quite grief and not quite resolve, but some specific combination of the two that he had learned over the years to simply sit with rather than fight. It came for him sometimes in the quiet. It had been coming for 14 years. He had stopped being surprised by it. He sat at the oak table until 4 in the morning. He drank coffee. He looked at Carol's photograph and Garrett Sims's photograph side by side on the table surface. He thought about Grover Hatch standing in this room the night before last, in his tailored uniform, walking his careful circuit through the wreckage his men had made, and the expression on his face that barely suppressed satisfaction. That small, mean pleasure that some men take from the destruction of things they fear and cannot openly admit to fearing. Rex had known men like Hatch his entire adult life. Men who built their sense of themselves entirely from the exercise of power over others. Men for whom authority was not a responsibility, but a possession, something to be hoarded and displayed, and occasionally used as a weapon against anyone who made them feel small. He had encountered them in uniform and suits behind desks, behind podiums. The uniform changed. The underlying machinery was always the same. What those men never understood, what Grover Hatch had fundamentally failed to understand about Rex Malone, was that there is a particular kind of man for whom the destruction of something precious does not produce surrender. It produces clarity. Rex had been clear since Tuesday. The raid on Thursday night had not changed his direction. It had simply removed any residual uncertainty about how far Hatch was willing to go, which was information Rex needed and now had. He put Carol's photograph back in his wallet at 4:15 in the morning. He left Garrett Sims's photograph on the table. He went to the back room and lay down on the cot that had been there for 20 years and closed his eyes and let himself rest without fully sleeping, which was a skill he had developed decades ago and which served him adequately until the first gray light began to show through the cracks in the boarded windows. At 6, he was up. At 6:30, Wade arrived with coffee from Crestline Diner. Donna had opened early, which was the kind of thing she did without being asked, which was why the charter had been looking after her and Gracie since long before the leukemia diagnosis. Rex drank the coffee standing up, looking at the boards on the windows, thinking through the sequence of the day one final time. Wade watched him. Frank's copy went to the Sacramento field office, Rex said. Agent named Garrison, Public Corruption Task Force. Wade nodded. When do they move on their timeline, Rex said. Not ours, which is fine. What happens today is separate from what happens next week. And if Hatch calls the bluff, Rex looked at him. It's not a bluff. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you know he's going to have people watching this lot this morning, from the time we start loading up. I know. He'll be on the phone to his deputies the second we roll out. He'll want everything in position well before we get to the line. I know, Rex, Wade said and stopped. Rex looked at him. Wade rubbed the back of his neck. He said, I just need you to know that whatever happens at that line, whatever he tries, I'm not going to do anything that gives him what he wants. Rex studied his sergeant-at-arms for a moment. Wade Briggs had been with him for 11 years. He had been there for things Rex did not think about in daylight. He was a man of controlled and specific loyalties, and when those loyalties were fully engaged, he was capable of a discipline that most people who looked at him would not have predicted. I know that too, Rex said. That's why you're still here. He set down his coffee. He picked up his cut from the back of the chair where it had been hanging since Thursday night and pulled it on. The leather was cold from the morning air coming through the boards. He adjusted the collar and smoothed the desert iron patch on the back and picked up his keys. Let's go get the bikes ready, he said. What Rex had told the charter the night of the raid, when the deputies had finally gone and the adrenaline had begun to metabolize, and the real weight of what had happened settled into the room, was that Saturday morning was going to proceed exactly as planned. Same time, same route, same discipline. The desert run was not a negotiation. It was not a request. It was a permitted charitable event organized by American citizens in full compliance with applicable law, and they were going to ride it. What he had not told them, because it was not their burden to carry, was the specific nature of what was in Frank Odom's sealed hard drive. What he had said was simply, trust me. And because they were his, and because he had never once in 16 years of leading this charter asked them to trust him without that trust being warranted, they had nodded and gotten up and started cleaning the clubhouse. It was 11 o'clock Thursday night when Rex's phone had first rung with the news that the morning's discipline would cost something additional. Donna's name on the screen. He had picked up. She did not say anything for a moment, and the silence told him everything before the words did. Two of them pulled out, she said finally. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person is using everything available to them just to keep speaking. The big ones, the hardware supply company and the construction materials distributor. Both called within an hour of each other this afternoon. Rex had stood very still in the damaged clubhouse. "How short are we?" he asked. "About 95,000, she said. "Maybe a little more." He heard something in the background. A counter edged the sound of a stool being steadied, and understood she was in the diner kitchen alone after closing in the only place she felt in control of anything. The image of it landed with more weight than he showed. "We'll cover it," he said. "Rex, we will cover it, Donna. I don't know the mechanism yet, but that number will be there when we need it." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that he could hear her breathing slow down by a fraction. "Okay," she said. Just that one word with the specific quality of a person who has decided to believe something because the alternative is unbearable. He stayed on the line until she hung up first. Then he had put his phone in his pocket and stood in the ruined clubhouse and looked at the wall and started making calculations. The calls he made that night and into the early hours of Wednesday morning were not to lawyers or journalists. They were to men and women across 4 states who owed Rex Malone something, not money, not favors in any transactional sense, but the specific and personal debt that accumulates between people who have shown up for each other at the moments that counted. He called a charter president in Reno who had not forgotten a particular February night in 2011. He called a woman in Flagstaff who ran a trucking operation and who had received very specific assistance from Rex Malone when her business was facing a particular kind of pressure 6 years ago. He called a retired contractor in 29 Palms and a bar owner in Victorville and a rancher in the Eastern Sierras whose property backed up against federal land and who understood the particular value of a neighbor who asked no questions and rendered help without conditions. He did not explain the full situation to any of them. He told them that he was 95,000 short of saving a 6-year-old girl's life and that he needed whatever they could move by Friday morning. He told them it was legal and clean and that he would personally account for every dollar. By Wednesday afternoon, the shortfall was covered. He did not tell Donna this immediately. He waited until Thursday evening after Frank had arrived and the USB drive was on the table and the full weight of what the next morning held was settled in the room, and then he called her and told her that the number was whole again. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said thank you in a voice that did not sound like gratitude, so much as the sound a person makes when they have been holding their breath for longer than they realized and have finally been allowed to exhale. The fairgrounds on the eastern edge of Copper Ridge began filling at 7 in the morning on Saturday. They came from Nevada and Arizona and Oregon, just as they had promised. They came from Bakersfield and Victorville and Needles and 29 Palms. They came from small desert towns whose names appeared on maps, but not in the kind of news that people in Sacramento and Los Angeles consumed. They came because word had moved through the network the way word moves in tight communities, quickly, completely, with none of the distortion that passes through larger and more impersonal channels. 411 motorcycles eventually staged at the fairgrounds. The sound of them idling in the early morning was a specific and unmistakable thing, a low collective rumble that you felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears, and it moved through the still desert air of Copper Ridge like something alive. Donna Pruitt arrived at 7:45 with Gracie in her arms. The little girl was wearing the vest. The Desert Iron Charter had made it specifically for her a proper cut scaled to a 6-year-old's dimensions with a chapter patch on the back and her name Gracie in block letters below it where the city patch would go on a full member. It was too large for her by a size, which somehow made it more rather than less affecting. She wore it over a pale pink sweatshirt, and her dark hair was pulled back, and her enormous brown eyes moved across the assembled machinery with an expression that was not fear but wonder, the specific wonder of a child who has not yet learned to pretend that extraordinary things are ordinary. Rex walked over to Donna. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had not slept and had been trying for 6 weeks to hold herself together through sheer force of will. She did not thank him. She was not a woman who performed gratitude for the cameras, which Rex respected deeply. She just looked at him and gave a single nod, which communicated everything that needed to be communicated between two people who understood what the morning meant. He nodded back. He walked back to his bike. At 8:45, Rex Malone kicked his Harley into gear. The formation that fell in behind him was not a crowd. It was a precision instrument, 411 motorcycles in organized columns, maintaining consistent spacing, moving with the specific discipline of people who have ridden together long enough to understand that chaos is a gift to your enemies. They rolled out of the fairgrounds in the direction of Highway 9, and the residents of Copper Ridge who had come out to line the route, and there were hundreds of them, standing on front lawns and on the sidewalks and on the roofs of the businesses along the main corridor, watched them pass with an attention that was very close to reverence. Rex rode without speaking. He rode looking straight ahead through the flat grid of the town he had lived in for 23 years past. The diner where Donna had poured his coffee for 9 years past. The hardware store whose owner had donated $3,000 to the Desert Run the day after the permit was revoked. Past the elementary school where a hand-lettered banner had appeared overnight on the chain-link fence that read, "Ride for Gracie" in red and blue paint. He did not look at the banner. He kept his eyes on the road. 2 miles east of town, Highway 9 straightened and widened, and the desert opened up on both sides into the particular vastness of the Mojave. In early morning, the low scrub and the Caliche Flats, and the mountains in the distance going purple and gold in the low-angle light. And at the end of that straight stretch, where the county line marker stood on the right shoulder, Grover Hatch was waiting. Rex had expected the plow trucks. He had expected the riot gear. He had even expected the news helicopters, which were audible before they were visible, the thumping of their rotors preceding them over the ridgeline to the north. What he had not expected, and what he allowed himself one moment of genuine appreciation for, was the scale of it. 5 county plow trucks parked in a staggered formation across all lanes of Highway 9, their yellow paint catching the morning sun. Behind them, 80 deputies in full tactical gear helmets, face shields, ballistic vests, riot batons, beanbag shotguns, and the additional weight of all the authority they had been told they represented. Behind the deputies, Hatch's cruiser and Hatch himself standing in front of it, with a bullhorn in his hand and the expression of a man who believed completely in the scene he was performing. The news helicopters overhead were broadcasting this live across the state. Rex brought the formation to a halt at 50 yards. He raised his left fist and the entire column idled down and stopped. 411 engines dropped to a collective low rumble and held their patient-controlled breathing. The discipline of it was, he knew, more unsettling to the line of deputies than any aggressive advance would have been. Aggression they knew how to answer. This they did not. Rex kicked down his kickstand. He swung his leg off the bike and stood on the asphalt for a moment, looking at the line of plow trucks and the men behind them and the helicopters above and the bullhorn in Hatch's hand. Then he began to walk. He walked alone across 50 yards of empty highway in the direction of 80 armed deputies and one very frightened politician. He walked at a steady pace, not rushing, not performing confidence, simply moving as a man moves when he knows exactly where he is going. His boots were loud on the asphalt. The morning air was cold. Behind him, 400 engines held their idle. Hatch raised the bullhorn when Rex was at 30 yards. Rex Malone Hatch's amplified voice announced across the desert, "You are in violation of a lawful county ordinance. You are ordered to disperse your organization immediately. This is your only warning." Rex kept walking. He stopped at 10 feet, close enough that the bullhorn was unnecessary, and Hatch let it drop slightly, which was a small victory of a particular kind. "Turn off the cameras," Rex said. His voice was not amplified. It did not need to be. "You have been ordered to disperse," Hatch said. His voice through the bullhorn was still controlled, still performing competence for the helicopters above. "You are out of options, Caulfield." He got the name wrong. Rex noted it and said nothing. He reached into his leather cut. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, and he saw the deputies on either side of Hatch shift and grip their weapons, and he continued the movement at exactly the same pace until his hand came out holding a legal-sized envelope sealed, which he held out in Hatch's direction. "I suggest you read this before you give any orders," Rex said. "The reporter from the Sacramento Bee is currently riding on the back of my sergeant-at-arms bike. She's been there since we left the fairgrounds. Hatch's eyes moved to the envelope. Something in his expression shifted, not much, not yet, just the faintest flicker of a man whose internal calculation is suddenly encountering an unexpected variable. He took the envelope. He tore it open with the practiced efficiency of someone who receives a great deal of correspondence and has learned to extract information quickly. He read. The bullhorn dropped further in his left hand. His right hand holding the documents began to develop a very slight tremor. Rex watched him read and said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence in the right moments does more work than any words. What was in the envelope? A summary document prepared by Frank Odom, 12 pages, with copies of the key wire transfer records attached. The incorporation papers for Ridgeline Properties, the routing numbers, the transaction history, and on the final page a photograph 8 by 10 printed on plain paper, but clear enough. Dale Hatch and Roderick Payne in the lobby of the Doubletree in Bakersfield shaking hands, both men looking directly at the camera from a distance they had believed was safe. Hatch read to the end. He stood with the documents in his trembling hand and stared at the last page for several seconds. The color had left his face in a way that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Rex stepped close enough that only Hatch could hear him. He kept his voice entirely level. "You've been stealing from this county for 4 years," he said. "You've been running seized asset money through your brother-in-law's company and into commercial real estate while you stood at podiums talking about law and order. That envelope is a copy. The original drive went to the Sacramento FBI field office yesterday morning. Agent Garrison on the Public Corruption Task Force signed for it personally." Hatch opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Rex continued, "If you give your deputies an order to advance in the next 60 seconds, the reporter on Wade's bike sends her story. Not tomorrow, not this afternoon. Right now from her phone while those helicopters are still up there filming. You will be arrested in front of this camera coverage as a sitting sheriff under federal investigation while your deputies are beating charity motorcyclists on live television. That is the scenario you have built for yourself." He paused. "Or you move the trucks." Hatch's jaw worked. His eyes, behind the professional facade that had been cracking since he opened the envelope, were those of a man standing in a room he suddenly does not recognize. He looked at the documents in his hand. He looked at Rex. He looked at the cameras above. He looked at his deputies, 80 men who believed in him, who had come here believing they were holding a necessary line, who were watching their commander and waiting for an order. "This is extortion," Hatch said. His voice had lost its amplified authority. It was just a voice now slightly hoarse, slightly unsteady. Rex looked at him without expression. "It's arithmetic," he said. "You have 60 seconds. Hatch stood there for what felt much longer than 60 seconds, but was in fact closer to 20. Then his hand went to the radio on his belt. Rex watched him raise it to his mouth. He watched the knuckles go white around the casing. "Command to all units," Hatch said into the radio. His voice had the specific flatness of a man speaking through clenched teeth. "Stand down, move the plows, clear the highway." The radio crackled. His second-in-command's voice came back confused and cautious, asking for confirmation. Hatch repeated the order. "Stand down, move the trucks, let them through." The sound of diesel engines starting was enormous in the desert quiet. The 5 county plow trucks ground their gears and reversed, pulling off the highway onto the gravel shoulders on either side, leaving the full width of Highway 9 open and empty in the morning light. The line of deputies lowered their shields. They did not put down their batons and they did not move from their positions, but the aggressive forward posture collapsed as the trucks moved, and what remained was simply 80 men standing in the desert looking at a thing they did not yet understand. Rex turned his back on Grover Hatch. He walked back across the 50 yards of asphalt to his motorcycle. He swung his leg over the seat. He looked at Wade Briggs, who was watching him from 2 bikes back, with an expression that contained beneath its controlled surface something that might, in a different man, have been visible as relief. Rex raised his arm. 411 engines came alive simultaneously. The sound was not describable in terms that did justice to the physical reality of it. It was a wall of sound, a weather event compressed into a single sustained note. It moved across the desert floor and up into the dry blue sky and scattered the scrub jays from the creosote bushes 100 yards off the road. The helicopters above banked slightly, their cameras tracking the formation as it began to move. Rex rolled forward. They went through the gap between the pulled-back plow trucks in a column so precise and so disciplined that it looked choreographed. No one revved aggressively. No one threw a gesture at the line of deputies. No one said a word. The formation simply moved 400 machines and the people on them flowing through the space that had been cleared for them with the unhurried absolute confidence of water finding its level. Rex did not look at Hatch as he passed. There was nothing more to say to Grover Hatch today. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to happen next was already in motion in an FBI field office in Sacramento, moving on its own timeline, which was not Rex Malone's timeline, but which would in its own time arrive at exactly the destination it needed to reach. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. The desert run proceeded south along Highway 9 for 14 miles through the open desert before looping back north and west through the outskirts of Copper Ridge and into the county fairgrounds where the infrastructure for the afternoon's event had been building since 6 in the morning. The route through town took them past every significant block of the community Rex had lived in for 23 years. And the people of Copper Ridge had come out for it in a way that he had not fully anticipated, and that if he was honest with himself in the privacy of his own thoughts, moved him in a way that few things moved him anymore. They lined the sidewalks 3 and 4 deep. They held signs. They held photographs of Gracie Pruitt that Donna had been distributing at the diner for the past 3 weeks. There were children on their father's shoulders, and old men standing with their arms crossed and their hats off, and women who were not trying to hide the fact that they were crying. When the formation turned onto the main commercial strip and the sound of 400 engines filled the corridor between the storefronts, the noise from the crowd built underneath it, and the two sounds merged into something that Rex felt in his chest alongside the engine vibration and could not entirely account for. He looked straight ahead. He rode. The fairgrounds were already full when they arrived. Thousands of people from Copper Ridge and from the surrounding communities had been gathering since morning. And when the formation came through the main gate and fanned out across the staging area, the sound that came from the crowd was the sound of a community that had been waiting to express something it had not had the right moment to express and had found it. Rex killed his engine. He sat on the bike for a moment before swinging off. The fairground smelled like barbecue smoke and dust, and the particular sweetness of a community celebration in the fall. And after the cold of the morning and the controlled tension of the confrontation on the highway, the warmth of it was something he felt physically. Donna Pruitt came through the crowd with Gracie in her arms. She pushed through the people around Rex's bike and she put her free arm around him, and Rex stood there with his arms at his sides for a moment before he raised one hand and put it on her back. She did not say anything for a long moment. Gracie reached out from her mother's arms and put her small hand on the lapel of Rex's leather cut and held it there. "We told you we'd take care of it," Rex said quietly. "You just focus on getting Gracie ready for Seattle." Donna pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were wet and her jaw was set, and she nodded once in the same way she had nodded at the fairgrounds that morning, communicating everything without performing anything. Rex looked down at Gracie. The little girl looked back at him with her enormous brown eyes, and then with the specific and unpredictable decision-making of a 6-year-old, she reached out and patted his cheek twice with her open hand, very gently, as if reassuring him of something. Rex Malone, who had not cried at his wife's funeral because crying at Carol's funeral would have required him to stop functioning, and stopping functioning was not something he could afford at the time, and he had simply never found the moment. Afterward felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately identify and did not examine closely. He cleared his throat. He said, "You're going to be fine, kid." She nodded very seriously, as if he had said something she had been waiting to have confirmed. The afternoon unfolded with a momentum that the morning's confrontation had, if anything, intensified. The barbecue went through its entire inventory in 3 hours. The silent auction, which featured custom motorcycle components, signed artwork from local artists, and a week's stay at a ranch property in the Eastern Sierras, donated by a charter member's cousin, drove bidding that exceeded the pre-event estimates by a significant margin. The country band from Bakersfield played for 4 hours and showed no inclination to stop. Children wore Ride for Gracie shirts that had been printed in runs of 500 and were gone within 2 hours of the gates opening. The two corporate sponsors who had withdrawn under Hatch's pressure calls both showed up at the fairgrounds that afternoon. Not with their original pledges, which they had pulled under the specific incredible threat of tax audit. They showed up in person, having watched the live broadcast of the highway confrontation that morning, and they both made their donations in cash in full, without any public announcement, and without asking for anything in return. Rex found out about it when Wade told him at 4 in the afternoon, passing the information along with the specific expression of a man who has just had a long-held belief confirmed. "People know who they want to be," Wade said. "Sometimes they just need the moment to be clear enough." Rex said nothing. He filed it away with everything else he was carrying. At 6 in the evening, Wade Briggs climbed onto the wooden stage that had been erected in the center of the fairgrounds and took the microphone from the country band's lead singer. The crowd quieted in the way that crowds quiet when they understand something significant is about to be said. Wade looked out at the several thousand people gathered in the late afternoon light of the Kern County desert. His scarred jaw and his steady eyes and his sergeant-at-arms patch were all equally visible and all equally him, which was the point. "Copper Ridge," he said. His voice through the PA was rough and precise. "This morning, some people tried to tell us that this road was closed." He paused. The crowd was absolutely still. We all saw what happened to that road. Someone near the front made a sound that became a ripple of reaction moving outward through the crowd. Wade waited for it to settle. "We finished counting the donations." He looked down at Donna, who was standing at the edge of the stage with Gracie on her hip. The little girl was wearing her vest. Between the entry fees, the auction, the barbecue, and the private contributions. He paused, and in the pause, the entire fairgrounds held its breath. The Desert Run has raised $319,000. What happened next in the Copper Ridge Fairgrounds was not politely described as applause. It was the sound of several thousand people releasing 6 weeks of accumulated fear and anger and grief and hope simultaneously, and it had a physical dimension that Rex felt through the soles of his boots on the packed earth. He was standing near the back of the crowd, leaning against his bike watching. He watched Donna's face. He watched her pull Gracie tight against her chest and put her face in her daughter's hair and stay there for a long moment while the sound built and broke around them like a wave. He watched Gracie look out over the crowd with her enormous eyes processing the noise, the way children process overwhelming things with pure attention, not yet filtered by the self-consciousness that comes later. Rex leaned against his motorcycle in the evening light and let the exhaustion of the previous 72 hours begin to move through him now that there was finally space for it. The confrontation on the highway, the sleepless night before it, Frank's drive down from the city, the look on Grover Hatch's face when he had read to the last page of the document and understood the specific nature of what he was holding. Across the fairgrounds, the band had resumed playing. People were dancing on the packed earth in the evening air, and children were running between the legs of adults. And somewhere near the stage, Wade Briggs was accepting a bottle of beer from a man Rex didn't recognize, and smiling genuinely. Smiling, which was not a frequent occurrence, and which, when it happened, tended to improve the quality of any room it appeared in. Rex stayed where he was. He thought about Grover Hatch not with satisfaction, because satisfaction was too simple and too clean for what this actually was. The corruption documented in Frank's files was real and substantial, and the harm it had done to ordinary people across Kern County was real. Rex did not feel bad about having used it, but he was also under no illusion that the day had resolved everything. Hatch was a cornered animal. He had backed down on the highway because the geometry of the situation had made backing down the least immediately catastrophic option available. But cornered animals did not stay still. They waited for the pressure to ease, and then they moved, and the direction of their movement was determined by fear rather than reason, which made it less predictable and more dangerous than the movement of a simply angry man. Rex was going to let him believe for a few days that the morning had been the full extent of the play. He was going to let Hatch begin to breathe again, because the file was not leverage anymore. The file was already in Sacramento, moving on a timeline that belonged to other people with different tools and deeper authority. Rex was simply going to wait alongside that process and let it complete. He looked up at the sky above the fairgrounds. The first stars were appearing in the east, faint and precise, above the dark ridge of the mountains. The Milky Way would be out in an hour the way it always was out here, away from the city light, enormous and indifferent to the human activity taking place beneath it. He pushed off from the bike and walked toward the stage, toward the noise and the light, and the people who were celebrating a battle they had won today, and a little girl who was going to Seattle. He had done what he came to do. The rest was already in motion. The celebration at the fairgrounds ran until 10 o'clock that night. By the time the last vehicles pulled out of the lot and the volunteers had broken down the stage and the band had loaded their equipment into their van and headed back toward Bakersfield, the temperature had dropped into the low 40s and the desert sky was doing exactly what Rex had expected. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a broad, dense arc that city people drove hours to see and that Rex had been falling asleep under, one way or another, for most of his adult life. He stayed until the end. He helped fold tables and stack chairs and load the rental equipment onto the trucks. He shook hands with riders from Nevada and Arizona who were heading back that night rather than waiting for morning. He accepted the embraces of people from Copper Ridge who had been standing on those sidewalks that morning, and who needed in the way that people sometimes need to put their hands on the physical reality of the thing that had happened. He let them. He was not a man who sought that kind of contact, but he understood its function, and he did not deny it to people who needed it. Wade found him near the gate at 9:45, carrying 2 bottles of water. They stood together without speaking for a while, looking at the empty fairgrounds and the dark mountains beyond and the sky above everything. 3:19, Wade said finally. Rex nodded. Wade drank from his bottle. Donna called the clinic in Seattle from the stage, he said. While you were in the back, the intake coordinator picked up. They have a bed available in 2 weeks. Rex was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good. That was all he said. Wade had known him long enough to read the specific quality of that silence, and he said nothing further. They stood for another few minutes, and then Rex told him to go get some sleep, and Wade nodded and walked to his bike. Rex drove home in his truck. He lived 6 miles east of town in a house he had owned for 18 years, a single-story structure on 2 acres of high desert, a covered porch on the south side, a workshop in the back where he kept his tools, and a second bike, and the particular organized disorder of a man who spent his leisure hours working with his hands. He pulled into the gravel drive and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, looking at the dark house, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. He went inside. He did not turn on the television. He did not look at his phone. He went to the kitchen and stood at the sink, drinking a glass of water, looking out the window at the darkness of the desert behind the property. And then he went to bed and slept for 9 hours without dreaming, which was more uninterrupted sleep than he had gotten in the previous 4 nights combined. He woke on Sunday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, none of which he answered immediately. He made coffee. He sat on the south porch in the morning cold and watched the light come across the desert floor and thought about nothing in particular for the better part of an hour, which was something he rarely allowed himself and which he understood without making a production of it that he needed. Grover Hatch spent Sunday in his office with the door locked. This was not information Rex had directly, but it was information that moved through the network in the days that followed the way information always moved through networks of people who paid attention to things. Hatch had sent his deputy chief home. He had dismissed his administrative assistant. He had sat alone in the large office with the photographs of politicians on the walls and the mahogany desk in the window that looked out over the county courthouse plaza. And he had drunk bourbon from a bottle he kept in the bottom drawer for occasions he did not anticipate sharing with anyone. By Monday morning, the fear had begun its predictable transformation. Rex had seen this before in men of Hatch's particular construction. Fear, when it is allowed to sit undisturbed for long enough without any countervailing pressure, does not remain fear. It metabolizes. It converts through the specific alchemy of a certain kind of ego into something that resembles confidence, but is actually much more dangerous, the arrogance of a man who has talked himself into believing that the worst has passed. Hatch's reasoning, as Rex would reconstruct it later from the evidence of his actions, went something like this. Rex Malone had used the documents as leverage on Saturday morning. Rex had gotten what he wanted. The road had been cleared. The run had happened. The money had been raised. Rex was fundamentally a practical man operating within a specific and limited objective. The objective had been achieved. The leverage had been spent. If the documents were going anywhere beyond the Saturday confrontation, they would already be in motion, and Hatch would already have heard something. The fact that he had not yet heard from the FBI, had not received a call, had not been contacted, had not seen any indication that the Sacramento field office was preparing to move, was in Hatch's revised internal accounting evidence that the threat had been theater. Tactical leverage deployed by a smart man used once and now exhausted. He was wrong about all of it. He was wrong in the specific way that men who have spent their careers believing that their authority insulates them from consequence are always wrong. Not through stupidity, but through a fundamental failure of imagination about what the world does to men like them when the protection finally runs out. By Tuesday morning, Hatch was on the phone with his brother-in-law. Dale Hatch ran his construction company, the legitimate face of Ridgeline Properties, from a small office in a business park in Tehachapi. He was 51 years old and had been the operational mechanism of the financial scheme. The actual signatory on the shell company accounts the man whose name appeared on the property deeds, while Grover provided the political cover and directed the flow of funds. If federal investigators were going to find their way through the structure, they were going to find Dale first. Hatch's call to Dale on Tuesday morning was about liquidation. The Ridgeline Properties portfolio needed to be unwound not immediately, not in a way that would trigger federal reporting requirements, but steadily converting the commercial real estate holdings into cash that could be moved offshore in increments below the detection threshold. Hatch communicated specific account information for 2 banks in the Cayman Islands. He believed the call was private. It was not private. It had not been private since Friday morning when Frank Odom's sealed drive arrived at the Sacramento field office and Agent Garrison of the Public Corruption Task Force had opened a formal investigation within 24 hours. The file Frank delivered was not a tip or an allegation. It was a complete, documented, forensically sound financial case that needed only verification against existing federal records rather than construction from scratch. By Tuesday afternoon, every phone line associated with Grover Hatch and Dale Hatch was being monitored under federal warrant. Rex did not know the specific details of this. He knew the broad shape of it. Frank had told him enough to understand the general timeline of how federal investigations moved once a file of this quality was in hand. He knew the process was running. He knew it would arrive where it needed to arrive. He spent Tuesday in the workshop behind his house rebuilding a carburetor on the second bike, a 1984 shovelhead that had belonged to a member named Curtis Pruitt, who died in 2014 and whose family had given Rex the bike when they moved out of state. The work was intricate and required attention, which was why he had been putting it off for months and why he chose to do it now. His hands needed something specific. His mind needed the particular quiet that came from mechanical work demanding precision. He worked through the afternoon. At 4 o'clock his phone rang. Donna, she said, we have the intake appointment confirmed for the 14th, 2 weeks from Thursday. Rex set down the carburetor tool. That's good news, Donna, he said. She said I talked to the financial coordinator this morning. The full amount transferred correctly. She said, and her voice shifted slightly, the careful steadiness cracking just at the edges. She said Gracie is a strong candidate. The protocol has had very good outcomes in cases like hers. Rex said, she's going to be fine. There was a pause, then Donna said quietly, you don't know that. No, Rex said, I don't. But I know she's going to have the chance. And that's what we were riding for. Another pause. Then, thank you, Rex. He did not tell her not to thank him. He let her say it. He went back to the carburetor. Wednesday passed. Thursday passed. On Friday morning, Rex drove into town for coffee at Crestline Diner and sat at the counter for an hour, which was the longest he had sat there in months, without the event timeline pressing down on everything. Donna poured his coffee and refilled it without being asked, and they talked about ordinary things, the weather coming in from the northwest, the rumor that the hardware store on Fifth was expanding into the vacant lot next door. Normal things. The texture of a life reasserting itself after 6 weeks of running at full pitch. He was almost back to his truck when his phone rang. Frank Odom, Rex Frank said. Hatch announced his formal candidacy for the state senate this morning. Press conference at the Copper Ridge Grand Hotel, Friday evening, 7 o'clock. Rex stood by his truck in the diner parking lot with the phone to his ear and looked out at the flat grid of the town in the morning light. He said, "Is that right?" "The man actually believes it's over," Frank said. "He thinks you used the file and walked away." He announced a Senate campaign, Rex. Rex said nothing for a moment. He watched a pickup truck pull out of the lot and head east toward the highway. Then he said, "What's Garrison's timeline?" Frank said, "I spoke with him yesterday. He said they have what they need. He said they've been waiting for the right moment." Rex said a Senate campaign announcement on live television in front of a room full of press is a pretty clean moment. There was a brief silence on Frank's end. Then Frank said, "That's more or less what Agent Garrison said." Rex got in his truck. He drove home. He went to the workshop and finished the carburetor work on the shovelhead and started the engine and listened to it run for 10 minutes, making small adjustments until it was turning over exactly as it was supposed to. Then he put his tools away and washed his hands at the utility sink and stood in the workshop doorway, looking out at the desert in the afternoon light. He thought about Grover Hatch at a podium in a hotel ballroom in a tailored suit, talking about law and order and the kind of California he was going to build. He thought about the wall in the clubhouse, the empty wall, the 19 men whose faces had been on the floor in broken glass while Hatch walked through in his polished boots. He thought about Carol. He thought about Gracie Pruitt on the 14th walking into a clinic in Seattle with her enormous brown eyes and her desert iron vest. He went inside and changed his shirt and drove back into Copper Ridge. The Copper Ridge Grand Hotel was the largest building on the main commercial corridor, a 4-story structure built in 1962 that had been renovated twice and currently operated as the closest thing the region had to a formal event venue. Its ballroom could seat 300. On Friday evening, it was holding approximately 240 people, local donors, county officials, members of the regional press corps, representatives from allied political organizations, and the specific category of individual who attends political announcement events, not from conviction, but from the calculation that proximity to rising power is its own form of investment. The chandeliers were lit. The tables were set with white linen. An open bar operated along the south wall. At the front of the room, a stage had been constructed with a podium bearing the seal of Kern County, and behind it a banner, dark blue, professionally produced, that read, "Hatch for California" in white block letters. Rex was not in the room. He had no reason to be in the room. What was going to happen there was going to happen whether or not he was present on the timeline of people who carried federal warrants rather than on his. He was parked on the street outside 2 blocks east in his truck, with the radio on low, drinking coffee from a paper cup he'd picked up at the gas station on the corner. Wade was parked 1 block north. They were not coordinating. They were not executing anything. They were simply 2 men who had been waiting for a particular conclusion for several days and who had arrived independently at the same decision about where they wanted to be when it came. Inside the ballroom at 7:12 in the evening, Grover Hatch stepped to the podium. He was wearing a dark navy suit pressed that afternoon. His silver hair was exactly as it was always exactly, and his jawline caught the light from the chandeliers, the way his jawline always caught light in rooms designed for it. He stood at the podium for a moment before speaking, the pause before the first word calibrated to produce anticipatory attention. It worked. The 240 people in the room gave him their silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hatch began, his voice settling into the practice register of formal address. "We live in challenging times." He spoke for 4 minutes about the state of California, about rising disorder and failing institutions, and the need for leadership that understood both the complexity of law and the simplicity of right and wrong. He was Rex would acknowledge if pressed genuinely skilled at this, at the rhythm of political speech, at the specific musicality of language designed to move people toward belief rather than thought. He had been doing it for 2 decades and had refined it into something close to an art form. He was 3 sentences into the formal announcement of his candidacy. I am today declaring my intention to seek the Democratic nomination for the 31st State Senate District when the ballroom doors opened. They opened the way federal agents open doors, not violently, not dramatically, but with the specific, unhurried authority of people who have never needed drama to make a point. 6 agents came through the main entrance, 2 more through the service entrance on the far side of the room. They wore tactical vests with FBI in yellow letters, and their hands were at their sides, not on their weapons, because they did not need their weapons. They had something considerably more effective. Special Agent Diane Holt was 44 years old with close-cropped dark hair and the measured, deliberate movement of someone who had spent a significant portion of her career in rooms where the wrong kind of speed produced the wrong kind of outcome. She had been with the Public Corruption Task Force for 11 years. She had arrested 2 state assemblymen, a sitting mayor, a county treasurer, and the former head of a regional hospital authority. She was not by any visible measure impressed by the room she was walking into or the man at the podium. She walked down the center aisle between the white linen tables with the purpose of someone who has done this before and will do it again, whose attention is entirely on the task rather than the theater of it. The room had gone completely silent in the way rooms go silent when they do not yet understand what they are witnessing, but understand clearly that it is significant. Hatch saw her coming from the stage. Rex would think about that moment later, about what it must have been like to be standing at a podium with 240 people in front of you and a campaign banner behind you, and the specific momentum of a long-prepared arrival at the center of your political life, and to look up and see Diane Holt walking toward you down the center aisle. He gripped the podium with both hands. His face did not move, but something behind his face moved, and the people close enough to see it would remember it. Holt stopped at the foot of the stage. She reached into the interior pocket of her vest and removed a folded document and held it up so that it was visible to Hatch and to the cameras that had been pointed at the stage for the announcement and were now pointed at her. "Grover Hatch," she said. Her voice did not require a microphone. The room was that quiet. "You are under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and federal tax evasion." She paused for one beat. "You have the right to remain silent." Hatch said, "This is a mistake." He said it into the open microphone, which meant it went through the room's sound system with full amplification, and it sounded exactly like what it was: a man saying the only words available to him because there were no other words. Holt said, "It is not a mistake. Please step down from the stage." Hatch did not move for 3 seconds. The room was so still that the sound of the chandeliers could be heard, the faint electrical hum above the absolute silence of 240 people who had come to watch a man announce his ascent and were watching something categorically different. Then his hands released the podium. He stepped back. He walked to the side stairs and came down them with the careful movement of a man whose legs are not entirely reliable. 2 agents moved to his sides when he reached the floor. The handcuffs were applied without drama, with the practiced efficiency of people for whom this was procedural rather than personal. The sound the handcuffs made going on was picked up by the open microphone and transmitted through the PA system to every corner of the ballroom. The press cameras, which had been set up to document a beginning, documented something else entirely. Dale Hatch was arrested at his home in Tehachapi at 7:21 that same evening, 9 minutes after his brother-in-law was being walked through the lobby of the Copper Ridge Grand Hotel, past the valet stand and the ornamental fountain and the stunned faces of the people who had come to celebrate him. Dale's attorney was reached at 7:40 and advised his client in terms that left no ambiguity that the federal evidence against him was comprehensive and that cooperation was not simply a strategic option, but the only rational available path. Dale Hatch contacted the FBI's Sacramento office at 9:15 that evening and indicated his willingness to provide full testimony in exchange for consideration at sentencing. Rex heard about the arrest from Wade, who heard about it from a contact inside the hotel who had attended as the representative of a local business association and who stepped outside at 7:16 to call Wade from the parking lot because the need to tell someone was immediate, and Wade was the person he called. Rex was sitting in his truck 2 blocks east with the radio on low when his phone rang. He listened to what Wade told him. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "All right, go home and get some sleep." He sat in the truck for a while after the call ended, looking at the street in front of him, the ordinary Friday night commerce of a small California city people, moving between the diner and the bar and the gas station, a couple walking a dog on the far sidewalk, the traffic light at the intersection cycling through its sequence for an audience of 2 cars. He started the truck and drove home. What followed moved through the weeks that came after with the procedural momentum of federal justice, which is slow by design and thorough by necessity. The case against Grover Hatch was airtight. The financial documentation was precise and complete. Dale Hatch's cooperation provided the human testimony that transformed records into narrative. The deputies who had signed off on the fabricated intelligence reports, the documents that had justified both the permit revocation and the Thursday night raid, came forward during the investigation with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for the opportunity. Hatch entered a plea negotiation in November. He had been told by 3 separate attorneys that the trial alternative was considerably worse. The plea was accepted in January of the following year. Grover Hatch was sentenced to 16 years in a federal correctional facility, stripped of his pension, his badge, and every title and appointment that had defined his public identity for 2 decades. Dale Hatch received 7 years under the cooperation agreement. The Kern County Board of Supervisors voted in December to suspend the civil asset forfeiture program pending a full independent review. The review confirmed what Frank Odom's documents had suggested and went further, establishing that the program had operated outside legal parameters for its entire 4-year existence under Hatch's direction, and that the county owed restitution to a significant number of individuals whose assets had been improperly seized. The highway checkpoint program on Highway 9 was discontinued entirely. The county's new interim sheriff, a 22-year veteran named Leonard Graves, who had spent most of Hatch's tenure running the records division and staying meticulously clear of anything connected to forfeiture operations, issued a public statement expressing personal regret about the events of the previous October, including specifically the permit revocation and the Thursday night raid on the Desert Iron Charters clubhouse. He did not call Rex Malone. He sent a letter handwritten, which arrived at the clubhouse on a Tuesday morning, in which Rex read once and set on the table and did not respond to, and did not throw away. The desert winter came and went. The shovelhead ran clean. The clubhouse front windows replaced in November with tempered glass let in the January light in the particular amber way that desert winter light enters rooms warm-toned, despite the cold outside, with the quality of light that has traveled a long way through clean air. The wall went back up in December. Wade had taken the photographs and the frames to a restoration shop in Bakersfield, and the man there had done careful work. Frames, straightened glass, replaced photographs, cleaned and mounted on fresh backing. They went back on the wall in the sequence Rex had established 21 years ago. Left to right chronological, the earliest losses at the starting edge and the most recent ones toward the center. 19 men, looking out from the wall the way they always had. Rex stood in front of the wall when the last frame went up and looked at each face for a moment. He had stood in front of this wall hundreds of times over the years. It looked and felt different now, having been on the floor, having been walked across in polished boots by a man who believed that destroying things was the same as defeating the people who valued them. He could not have said precisely how it was different. The photographs were the same, the faces were the same. The chronology was unchanged. But something in how he stood in front of it had shifted, and he accepted that without trying to name it more specifically than it deserved. Gracie Pruitt went to Seattle on the 14th of November. Donna drove her up in a rented car with 2 bags and the Desert Iron vest and a small stuffed dog that Gracie had slept with every night since she was 3. Rex did not go to Seattle. He had considered it and decided it was not the right thing that Donna and Gracie needed to arrive at that clinic as what they were, a mother and her daughter, rather than with a delegation from a motorcycle club, however well-intentioned. He called Donna on the evening of the 14th after she had checked Gracie in and gotten her settled in the intake room and walked to the apartment 2 blocks from the clinic that the Desert Run funds were covering. "How is she?" he asked. "She was asking the nurses about their jobs," Donna said. "She wanted to know what every piece of equipment did. She told one of the doctors she was going to be a doctor too, except on motorcycles." Rex was quiet for a moment. "She'll be fine," Donna said softly. "I think she'll be fine." He said, "I know." He meant it differently than he had meant it in October when he had said it standing in Donna's kitchen, without yet being able to back it up with anything beyond will. He meant it now with something grounded in the specific reality of a little girl who interrogated nurses about their equipment and announced her career plans to oncologists and wore a motorcycle club vest over her hospital gown. December came. The protocol progressed. Donna called on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying the particular careful steadiness of a person managing difficult information at close range. "The treatment is doing what it's supposed to do," she said. "She's making friends on the ward. There are 2 other kids about her age. She taught one of them how to play war with a deck of cards she found in the common room." Rex stood at his kitchen window looking out at the winter desert and listened and said, "That's good, Donna." "It is," she said. "It really is." January brought cold nights across the Kern County desert and news from Seattle that the early results were, in the oncologist's measured and careful language, extremely encouraging. Rex received this information from Donna in a phone call he took, sitting on the south porch of his house in the dark, looking at the stars, and he stayed on the line for a long time after she had finished telling him long enough that she asked if he was still there. "Still here," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you are." The package arrived on a Wednesday morning in April. Rex was in the clubhouse when Wade brought it in a standard cardboard shipping box, addressed in a woman's handwriting, to the Desert Iron Motorcycle Club, Copper Ridge, California. No return address, but the postmark was from a post office in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle. The charter members who were present gathered without being called to gather, which was something that happened sometimes in clubs that had been together long enough, the collective understanding that a particular moment was occurring and that it should not occur unwitnessed. Rex stood at the oak table and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a single layer of tissue paper, was a framed photograph. 8 by 10 in a simple dark frame. He lifted it out and held it. Gracie Pruitt standing on a beach. The water behind her was gray-green in the way that Puget Sound is gray-green in early spring, and the sky above it was the particular pale silver of a Pacific Northwest morning when the clouds are high and diffuse and the light comes through them without a visible source. She was wearing the Desert Iron vest over a bright yellow long-sleeve shirt. Her hair, the dark hair that had been there in the photograph Wade had set on the table 7 months ago, and that the chemicals had taken, which they had to, which Donna had told him about in December, in a voice that was steady, but only just barely. Her hair was coming back. Short, barely an inch, lying close to her head in dark curls. But it was there. It was growing. She was giving a thumbs up to the camera with both hands simultaneously, which required a specific kind of balance and produced the expression of a child who is aware of performing something and is delighted by her own performance of it. She was smiling the way she had been smiling in the photograph from 7 months ago, the pale-faced, pre-treatment version of herself that Rex had looked at that first evening and made his decision. But the smile was different now. Bigger. More certain of itself. The smile of someone who has been through something and come out the other side and knows it. Rex turned the photograph over. On the back in Donna's handwriting, "The doctors say she is in full remission. She is coming home. Thank you for writing for her." The clubhouse was quiet. Rex stood at the table holding the photograph. Around him, the men who had ridden beside him from the beginning, and the men who had joined the formation at the fairgrounds, and the men who had been face down on the concrete floor when the SWAT team came through the windows. They were all looking at the same thing he was looking at, and no one said anything, and the silence was not awkward or empty. It was the specific silence of people who have shared something significant enough that words sit below it rather than above it. Rex walked to the wall. He took a nail from the shelf below it and the hammer that lived on the same shelf and drove the nail into the center of the wall. At the height, his eyes naturally fell directly above the desert iron patch painted on the wall surface. He hung the photograph. Gracie Pruitt on a gray-green beach with her thumbs up and her new hair and her desert iron vest. He stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. All 20 faces on the wall now. 19 men he had lost, and one little girl who had come back, which was not a symmetry he had planned, and not one he would have chosen, but which was the kind of symmetry the world occasionally produced without being asked and without apology. He turned around and faced the room. "All right, brothers," he said. His voice was what it always was, low, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who says few things but means all of them. "Let's get the bikes fueled." He paused. "We've got a little girl to welcome home." The charter moved. The sound of it was the sound of men who know what they are doing and why chairs, push-back jackets, pulled-on keys coming off hooks, boots on the concrete floor moving toward the door, in the lot, and the machines waiting outside in the April morning. Rex was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway and turned back to look at the wall one final time. The morning light coming through the tempered glass, the new glass, the glass that had replaced what Hatch's men had destroyed, fell across the photographs at the angle that April light takes in the high desert, warm and specific and clear. He looked at Gracie's photograph in the center of the wall. He looked at Garrett Sims to the left of her and the other 18 men arranged in their chronological order on either side. And he understood, standing there in the doorway of a place that had been violated and rebuilt and was now something slightly different from what it had been before, that this was what the wall had always been for. Not a monument to loss, a record of what persisted, what continued, what refused, despite everything, to stop. He pulled on his gloves and walked out into the morning. The desert in April had a quality that the other seasons didn't. A brief and specific window between the cold of winter and the arriving weight of summer heat, when the air was clean and cool, and the light was strong without being brutal, and the creosote was putting out its small yellow flowers, and the whole landscape had the aliveness of something that has survived another year of extremity and finds itself without quite expecting to still here. He kicked the Harley into gear. Around him, the lot filled with sound engines coming alive one after another, overlapping, building into the collective resonance that he had felt in his chest for 30 years, and that still on mornings like this one, with a purpose, this clear and a road this open, felt like the truest expression of something he could not have put into words and did not need to. He looked back once at the clubhouse, at the new glass in the front windows catching the morning light, at the wall inside which he could not see from here, but which he carried the way he carried Carol's photograph, always present, weighted with the specific gravity of things that mattered, and the equally specific gravity of things that had been fought for and won. Then he pulled out of the lot and onto the road, and the formation fell in behind him, and they rode west into the morning light toward the highway and the town, and a little girl in a yellow shirt with her hair growing back who was coming home.